Hey everyone, how's it going? I want to make a video about Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. This is a bit of a peculiar book because it is basically a collection of letters that Rilke probably wrote without the intention of having published. He wrote these letters in the early 1900s to a man named Franz Kappes, who is a 19-year-old young man who was going into the army and wanted advice from Rilke about whether or not he should become a poet, and also wanted feedback on the poetry that he had tried to write. Although in the very first letter, Rilke says that he refuses to offer any in-depth feedback on the poetry because he looks down upon literary criticism as such, which is kind of funny to read as a booktuber, since I guess what booktubers do is sort of kind of a low-grade version of literary criticism, and that's a theme that he keeps returning to, is that his distrust of literary criticism. So the letters themselves were actually published after Rilke's death in 1929. It was about 4 years after his death in 1925. This translation, which is put out by Modern Library, is done by Stephen Mitchell, who also did a really great translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and has translated some of Rilke's poetry and many other things. And this was published first in 1984. And so these letters are really, really interesting. It's actually, this is a really slim book. It's really tiny. It's just over 100 pages, and I'll just give you a glimpse of the margins. Hopefully you'll be able to see that the margins are huge. The margins are huge, and the spacing is huge. So honestly, it reads a bit more like an extended essay. It probably could easily be included just in a volume of essays, because it is just that short. And yet, despite its short length, I feel a lot of trepidation, to be honest, coming into this video about whether or not I'll ever be able to do the book justice, because it's one of those books that's short, but it's so jam-packed with insights and ideas to chew on and eloquence that while I was reading it, I felt like I needed to really slow down and chew on it a lot. There are some letters in here that are 5 pages long, but you'll be thinking about them long after you finish them, and some of them you'll even want to reread immediately. I buddy read this with Aaron Facer, who has a channel, and he often, in his messages to me about the book, he would often talk about how he read some of the letters like many times, and just to sort of wrap his head around them, kind of. I feel inclined to reread this book in the not too distant future, maybe at the beginning of next year, just to in the same way, kind of wrap my head around it, because there's so much jam-packed into it. But as you can imagine, it does begin with some advice about becoming a writer and whether or not you should become specifically a poet, and there is a little bit of sort of writing advice, although there isn't much in the way of what we would call conventional writing advice. This isn't like a manual like On Writing by Stephen King, but Rilke in his first letter starts with probably the most famous quote from the book, which is where he says that you should not become a poet unless, quote, you would have to die if you were forbidden to write. So that's the most famous quote from the book, and it's quite a high bar to reach. And I've heard from some people that was reading that quote was their realization that they shouldn't become a poet or shouldn't become a writer, because while they enjoyed writing, they didn't feel that level of devotion to it. But he continues on from that to talk about not only like how to write, but also like what to write, which I thought was interesting. So very early in the book, he says about writing poetry, he says, quote, avoid those forms that are too facile and ordinary. They are the hardest to work with, and it takes great, fully ripened power to create something individual where good, even glorious, traditions exist in abundance. So he seems to be encouraging Kappes to not write, if you're going to write poetry, don't write sonnets, don't write a haiku. These are forms with a long tradition, a very ancient tradition in some cases, and so that it will be really difficult for you to do justice to them. And so he seems to be encouraging him to do something a little bit different, not too different, because I think if you're going to write poetry, you probably need to sort of have down sort of the rules of poetry before you can get too experimental, but definitely he seems to be encouraging Kappes not to begin with more conventional things. Do something that feels a bit more personal. And he does also constantly return to this idea that if you're going to create a work of art, it needs to come from within your own personal experience of nature, and it needs to arise out of necessity, I think he says at one point in the book. And that's not to say that all art has to be autobiographical. It just has to come from something that really moves you as an individual. He talks about a lot of things regarding art. Aside from that, he talks about kind of the nature of art, the nature of the artistic endeavor. He kind of compares it actually to the experience of love and the experience of procreation and the sexual experience, which is all rather interesting. And he even talks a little bit about sort of where to find inspiration for writing. He writes at one point, this is one of my favorite passages in the book, he says, quote, "If you trust in nature, in what is simple in nature, in the small things that hardly anyone sees and that can so suddenly become huge, immeasurable, if you have this love for what is humble and try very simply, as someone who serves, to win the confidence of what seems poor, then everything will become easier for you, more coherent, and somehow more reconciling. Not in your conscious mind, perhaps, which stays behind, astonished, but in your innermost awareness, awakeness, and knowledge." And so he gives advice on becoming a writer, whether or not you should become a poet, where to find artistic inspiration, which also comes very much from solitude, from finding solitude and cultivating solitude. And he has a really interesting passage about finding and cultivating solitude, and how a lot of us believe that we sort of don't have the sort of time for solitude because we're so busy with everything, with our jobs, with everything else. But he kind of says, and he kind of critiques an idea that I see in a lot of other people, is that they don't have time to create room for solitude in their lives, and they think that at some point later in their life they'll have the time for solitude, when they get a better job or when they retire or something. But he emphasizes that if you're not gonna make the time now, then you're not gonna have the time ever, probably. And I think that was all very interesting, and you might not agree with all of it. There certainly, I think, are people who would take issue with some of the things he says in the book, but definitely I think it is food for thought. But he very quickly progresses from talking about art and the creation of art and the nature of art to just kind of giving general life advice, and putting it like that sort of trivializes what he's saying, to my mind. But he really gives some really interesting just commentary on life and the universe and everything, if I can put it that way. And the piece of advice that I think I love the most from the book is the idea of self-examination that he puts forth in the book. He constantly is emphasizing, looking inside of yourself, trying to know thyself, to use the old Greek term. But he also, I think, adds an interesting caveat to the assertion that you should try to know yourself and examine yourself. And it's that you should also be patient when examining yourself. You shouldn't rush to conclusions about what's gone on in your own life and your own character, because that can lead to some harmful conclusions that can lead you to blame certain life events for the kind of person you've become before you have enough perspective to kind of know how something has affected you, and to really know what your character is. And I think the idea of self-examining but being patient in your self-examination is really, really interesting. I'd never quite looked at it that way. And that I think speaks to another idea that he raises a lot in this book, which is you should be sort of comfortable in questioning. You should be sort of comfortable with not knowing things, and there being mysteries in the world, and not feel like you need to know everything. There's so much more I could comment on with the book, because he also talks about sort of this sort of intellectual humility, this idea that you shouldn't think that you're smarter than the world or smarter than other people. And he seems to also sort of criticize people who are overly critical in a sort of self-righteous or self-aggrandizing way, where they think they're smarter than someone who's devoted their entire life to a field of study. One last idea that I want to touch on in the book, because I thought it was so interesting, was that he occasionally alludes, I think, to the theory of evolution, basically. And what I think is so interesting is he takes ideas that sound reminiscent of the theory of evolution, and I don't know whether I'm reading this into it because it seems like it, because of the translation, but it seems like he takes this idea of natural selection, which is often sort of talked about as a very mechanistic, cold theory, and makes it seem beautiful, makes it seem poetic, And I'll read you the passage where I thought that was at work. So this is that passage. Quote, "We have been put into life as into the element we most accord with, and we have, moreover, through thousands of years of adaptation, come to resemble this life so greatly that when we hold still, through a fortunate mimicry, we can hardly be differentiated from everything around us. We have no reason to harbor any mistrust against our world, for it is not against us. If it has terrors, they are our terrors. If it has abysses, these abysses belong to us. If there are dangers, we must try to love them." I think primarily my connection with the theory of evolution comes with that use of the word adaptation, which is obviously a very Darwinian word, but again, it's an English word, and I don't know whether that corresponds with the German. So I love that idea that adaptation, natural selection, is this poetic idea rather than a sort of cold mechanistic theory. Two more related ideas to end with that I think are encapsulated in that quote to a degree as well is I think there's a strong influence of Stoic philosophy in this, when he says that if there are any terrors, they are our terrors. That strikes me as a very Stoic influenced idea, this idea that, you can never control what's happening in the outside world, but you can control your own response to it. That strikes me as very Stoic, coming very much from Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And then another idea that I think is, again, maybe more alluded to than elaborated on in that quote, but which he does elaborate on at other points, is this kind of Buddhist and also Hindu idea that, even though when we, with our tiny human brains, look at the world and see this huge diversity of objects and living beings and phenomena, ultimately everything is actually just one substance, is just one unified thing. And so we shouldn't see ourselves as separate from the universe, but as one with it. And he emphasizes that as well. So anyway, yeah, there's so many ideas in this book that I didn't really feel like I was ever going to do it justice, and I don't feel like I really have. But I wanted to give some quotes, some major ideas from the book to you that I found the most interesting, and hopefully it approached some level of coherence. But yeah, if you have read the book, give me your thoughts on it, and if you haven't read the book but want to, let me know. And I will just leave it at that, and hope that this video is helpful or interesting to some people, and I will let you all go now. Bye.